For nearly a year, retired Sheriff Arthur Finch has started every morning the same way, staring at a map of boundary waters, the sprawling wilderness that swallowed his daughter, Nora, and her fiancé, Caleb. The official search was called off months ago, concluding they were victims of a sudden squall and the unforgiving lake. But Arthur refuses to accept it, the silence from the woods a constant gnawing ache. That is, until a park ranger calls about a splintered canoe paddle found washed up in a muddy cove, miles from their last known location, with two words crudely carved into the wood: turn back. This story is a testament to a father's refusal to give up, even when all hope seems lost. Stick with us as we uncover a dark secret hidden deep in the wilderness. And if you find yourself moved by this journey, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of determination and justice. The old paper map was tacked to the corkboard above his desk, its surface worn thin from a year of constant study. Creases marked the routes the search parties had taken, and faint pencil lines traced the paths Arthur himself had walked, over and over, until the snows came and made the trails impassable. Every lake, every portage, every stretch of shoreline was a question without an answer. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness was over 1 million acres of raw, untamed nature, and somewhere inside it, his daughter was gone. Arthur ran a hand over his tired face, the rough stubble scratching his palm. At 63, he felt 100. Retirement was supposed to be about fishing with his grandkids someday, about quiet mornings with his wife Helen. But Helen was gone 3 years now, and the quiet was no longer peaceful. It was just empty. The search for Nora and Caleb had become the single beam holding up the structure of his life. Without it, he feared he would collapse into nothing. He'd been the sheriff of this county for 30 years. He knew this wilderness. He knew its moods, its dangers, and its deceptive beauty. And he knew his daughter. Nora had practically grown up in a canoe. She was cautious, skilled, and respectful of the woods. The official story that she and Caleb, an equally experienced outdoorsman, were caught off guard by a sudden storm and capsized in the middle of a large lake, had never sat right with him. Their canoe was found, overturned and empty, but that was it. No bodies, no gear, nothing. It was too clean, too simple. Accidents in the Boundary Waters were messy. They left a trail. This felt like an erasure. His coffee had gone cold. He took a sip anyway, the bitter liquid a familiar companion to his thoughts. He remembered the last time he'd seen them, standing in his driveway, their red canoe strapped to the roof of their car. Nora's smile was as bright as the June morning. "Don't worry, Dad," she'd said, hugging him tight. "We'll be back in a week with enough fish stories to last you all winter." Caleb had shaken his hand firmly. "I'll take good care of her, Arthur. I promise." A week turned into 10 days. 10 days turned into 2 weeks. The search began, filled with the frantic, organized energy of people who believed they could win against the wilderness. Helicopters, search dogs, dozens of volunteers. They found the canoe on day 16. After that, the energy slowly bled away, replaced by solemn looks and sympathetic murmurs. The official search was suspended after a month. The volunteers stopped coming. Winter arrived, burying the woods under a thick blanket of white silence. But Arthur kept going, until even he had to admit defeat against the elements. The ringing of the phone sliced through the quiet of the house, making him jump. He rarely got calls this early. He walked to the kitchen and picked up the receiver. "Arthur Finch." "Arthur, it's Hank down at the ranger station." Hank's voice was usually calm, almost sleepy, but today it had an edge. "Listen, I think you should come down here. A couple of hikers found something this morning." Arthur's heart began to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against his ribs. "What is it, Hank? What did they find?" "It's a canoe paddle. Well, you just need to see it for yourself. It was found washed up in a muddy bank on the north side of Saganaga Lake. That was near their intended route, but the north side. That was wrong. The storm that supposedly took them had come from the north, pushing everything south. If they had capsized, the debris should have been on the southern shores. "I'm on my way," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. He hung up the phone and stood still for a moment, his hand resting on the counter. For the first time in months, it wasn't grief that filled the emptiness in his chest. It was something else, something sharp and demanding. Hope. The drive to the ranger station was a blur of pine trees and winding asphalt. Arthur's mind raced, replaying every detail of the case, every theory he'd ever considered. He'd learned long ago as a sheriff that hope was a dangerous thing. It could blind you, make you see patterns that weren't there. But the location Hank had mentioned, the north side of the lake, was a fact. It was a detail that didn't fit the official narrative. And in any investigation, a detail that doesn't fit is a thread you pull on until something unravels. Hank was waiting for him outside the station, a small weathered building that smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He was a good man, younger than Arthur, but he had the quiet competence of someone who understood the woods. He led Arthur inside without a word. On the main counter, laid carefully on a clean towel, was the paddle. It was a beaver tail, made of cherry wood, just like the ones Caleb had painstakingly refinished the winter before they left. The varnish was peeling, and the wood was dark and waterlogged. The end of the blade was horribly splintered, shattered, as if it had been slammed against a rock with incredible force. But it was the middle of the blade that made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. 2 words had been gouged into the wood, carved with something sharp and rough, like the point of a knife or a sharp piece of stone. The letters were uneven, frantic. "Turn back." Arthur reached out and traced the carving with a trembling finger. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, a warning. This was Nora, or Caleb. It had to be. "Where exactly did they find this?" Arthur asked, his voice low and steady, masking the storm of emotions inside him. Hank unfolded a large map on the counter, the same one Arthur had on his wall at home. He tapped a location with his finger. "Right here, in a small, marshy cove, almost hidden from the main lake. It's a good 6 miles north of where their canoe was found." Arthur stared at the map. The cove was little more than a notch in the vast, jagged shoreline. He knew the spot. It was quiet, secluded. Not a place you'd end up by accident, and definitely not a place the currents would carry wreckage against a strong north wind. "Something else," Hank said, looking uncomfortable. "The hikers who found it. They said it looked like it had been deliberately jammed into the mud, not just washed up. Deliberately placed. A marker." "This changes things, Hank," Arthur said, looking up from the paddle. His mind was clear, the fog of grief replaced by the cold, sharp focus of an investigator. "I know. Hank said quietly. "That's why I called you first. The current sheriff, Peterson. He'll just log it as evidence and file it away. He's already made up his mind about what happened." Sheriff Peterson was a good administrator, but he lacked the gut instinct that a lifetime of policing in this county had given Arthur. Peterson saw statistics and probabilities. He saw a tragic but common accident. Arthur looked at the paddle and saw a crime scene. "Can I take it?" Arthur asked. Hank hesitated. "It's evidence, Arthur. I'm supposed to turn it over to Peterson." "Let me borrow it for a day," Arthur pressed. "I want to take it out to the cove myself, see the spot. Sometimes seeing where something was found tells you more than the thing itself." After a long moment, Hank nodded. "One day. Bring it back tomorrow morning. And Arthur, be careful. If this is what it looks like, then whoever did this is still out there." Arthur carried the paddle to his truck like it was a sacred object. It was more than just a piece of wood. It was the first word from his daughter in a year. A desperate, terrified word. Back at his house, he laid the paddle on his kitchen table and began to work. He pulled out his own maps, more detailed than the rangers, and marked the location of the cove. He drew lines, calculating possible drift patterns, wind directions, and travel times. Nothing added up to the official storm theory. The paddle could not have ended up there by chance. His eyes kept drifting to a large, mostly blank area on the map just north of the cove. It was a massive tract of land, hundreds of acres of dense forest and rocky hills that bordered the lake. The property was marked with a single name, Barlow. As sheriff, Arthur had dealt with the Barlows a handful of times over the decades. They were a family that kept to themselves, living off the grid on land that had been in their name since the late 1800s. They didn't like outsiders. They didn't like the government. They especially didn't like people trespassing on their land. The patriarch, Jedediah Barlow, was a hard, unforgiving man who believed the modern world was a disease. He and his sons lived by their own rules. Arthur remembered an incident about 10 years back. A tourist lost his way while hiking and stumbled onto their property. The Barlows held him at gunpoint for 6 hours before marching him to the edge of their land and telling him if they ever saw him again, they'd bury him where no one would ever find the body. The tourist was too scared to press charges. The Barlows claimed he was a government spy. Could Nora and Caleb have accidentally paddled into their territory? It was possible. The cove where the paddle was found was less than a mile from the edge of the Barlows' unmarked shoreline. Maybe they'd gotten into trouble, sought help at the first place they saw, and stumbled into a nightmare. The thought was like ice in his veins. But it was a lid, a real, tangible lead. He packed a small bag with supplies, a compass, his best pair of binoculars, a flashlight, and a protein bar. He also went to the gun safe in his bedroom. His service revolver felt heavy and familiar in his hand. He hadn't worn it since the day he retired. He checked the cylinder, loaded it, and tucked the holster into the back of his belt, covering it with his jacket. He was no longer the sheriff, but he was still a father, and he was going to find out what happened to his daughter. He launched his own small fishing boat from a public access point, miles away from the Barlow property. The lake was calm today, its surface like dark glass, reflecting the endless blue sky. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that made you forget the lake had a cold, hungry darkness beneath its surface. As he motored across the open water, He felt the familiar mix of love and fear this place always inspired in him. He taught Nora how to fish on this very lake, taught her how to read the clouds and respect the water. He cut the engine as he approached the coordinates Hank had given him, letting the boat glide silently into the cove. It was just as Hank had described, a marshy, muddy inlet, thick with reeds and shielded by a rocky outcrop. It was a perfect place to hide or to be hidden. He anchored the boat and carefully stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft mud. The air was still and heavy. He found the spot where the hikers had pulled the paddle from the mud. The impressions were still there. He stood for a long time, just looking, trying to see the scene through Nora's eyes. What happened here? Did she stand on this very spot? Was she alone? Was she scared? He scanned the shoreline. To his left was public forest land. To his right, less than a mile away, the forest grew thicker, darker. That was where the Barlow land began. There were no fences, no signs. There didn't need to be. Everyone knew. Instead of heading straight for their property, Arthur decided on a different approach. He needed more information. He got back in his boat and headed for Grand Marais, the nearest supply town. It was a small, tourist-friendly place on the shore of Lake Superior, but it served as the gateway to the Boundary Waters, and its year-round residents were a tight-knit community of outfitters, guides, and old-timers who knew every secret the woods held. He tied up his boat at the town dock and walked up the street to a dusty, cluttered shop called Boundary Outfitters. An old hand-carved sign hung crookedly above the door. Inside, the smell of canvas, leather, and old wood was thick in the air. A man with a wild gray beard and kind eyes looked up from behind a counter where he was mending a fishing net. "Well, I'll be," the man said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Arthur Finch. Thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "Not yet, Silas," Arthur said, shaking his hand. Silas Blackwood had been one of Arthur's first deputies, a young, eager kid back then. He'd left the force after a few years, claiming he preferred the company of trees to people, and opened this outfitter shop. But he'd kept his ears open. Silas knew more about what went on in the backcountry than any official source. "What brings you out of hiding?" Silas asked, his smile fading as he saw the grim look on Arthur's face. "It's about Nora, isn't it?" Arthur nodded. He told Silas about the paddle, the location, the carving. He didn't show him the paddle itself. He'd locked it in his truck. Silas listened intently, his fingers still working the net out of habit. When Arthur was finished, Silas set the net down and leaned on the counter, his expression serious. "The Barlows," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "You think so too?" Arthur replied. "The cove where they found it. That's practically their front yard," Silas said. "I've heard stories, Arthur. More than usual lately. Jedediah's gotten worse since his wife passed, more paranoid. And his boys, Corbin and Malachi, they're just as mean as him, but without the sense to be cautious. They've been running off hunters and fishermen all year, claiming they own half the lake." "Have there been any official complaints?" Silas snorted. "Who's gonna complain? Peterson? He doesn't want the paperwork, and nobody wants to be the one to poke that hornet's nest. Last fall, some photographer from the cities was trying to get shots of the fall colors, flew a drone up the shoreline. The moment it crossed onto Barlow land, one of the sons shot it out of the sky with a shotgun. Peterson went out there to ask about it. Jedediah claimed they thought it was a government spy drone, said it was their right to protect their privacy. Nothing ever came of it. The story confirmed what Arthur already suspected. The Barlows were operating under their own law, and they were volatile. "I'm going out there, Silas," Arthur said. Silas's face hardened with concern. "That's a fool's errand, Arthur. You're not the sheriff anymore. They won't see you as the law. They'll see you as a trespasser, and they don't take kindly to trespassers." "She's my daughter," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. It was the only explanation needed. Silas studied him for a long moment, then sighed and nodded. "I know. Just watch your back. They've got the home field advantage. They know every rock and every tree on that land. You won't be able to sneak up on them." "I'm not planning to," Arthur said. "Not yet." He thanked Silas for the information and walked back toward the lake. His resolve hardened. Silas's warning hadn't scared him off. It had done the opposite. It had convinced him that the Barlow property was exactly where he needed to look. He decided not to wait. The daylight was good, and he didn't want to give the Barlows any more time. He piloted his boat back up the lake, but this time he didn't go to the cove. He chose a spot about a mile down the shore from where he estimated the Barlow property line was. He beached the boat in a hidden inlet, camouflaging it with some branches before he started his hike inland. The forest was thick and unforgiving. He moved slowly, deliberately, every sense on high alert. The skills he'd learned over a lifetime, tracking, moving silently, observing, came back to him as if he'd never taken off the badge. After about 20 minutes of careful hiking, he found the first sign, a thin, almost invisible tripwire strung between two trees, connected to a set of empty cans that would have rattled if disturbed. It was a crude but effective alarm system. He carefully stepped over it. 100 yards later, he found another, and then a sign, nailed to a tree. The paint was faded, but the message was clear. A rough drawing of a skull and crossbones, with the words, "No trespassing. Survivors will be prosecuted," painted beneath it. The word prosecuted was misspelled. This wasn't just a private retreat. This was a fortified perimeter. He was getting close. He left the faint trail he'd been following and began to climb a rocky ridge that overlooked the area, hoping for a vantage point. The climb was strenuous, and his lungs burned, but he pushed on. When he reached the top, he crawled the last few feet on his stomach and peered over the edge. Below him, nestled in a small valley, was the Barlow compound. It was just as he'd imagined, a large rustic log house with smoke curling from its chimney, a massive barn that looked older than the house itself, several smaller outbuildings, and a large fenced-in garden. It was completely self-sufficient. He pulled out his binoculars and settled in to watch. For a long time there was no movement. Then a door on the main house opened, and a man emerged. He was tall and lean, with a long, unkempt beard. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, as if it were a natural extension of his body. Arthur recognized him from old file photos. Malachi Barlow, the younger son. Malachi walked the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. He moved with the quiet confidence of a predator in its own territory. Arthur stayed perfectly still, his breathing slow and even. He watched as another man, broader and more heavily built, Corbin, the older brother, came out of the barn and began chopping wood with a powerful rhythmic swing of an axe. The scene was almost peaceful, a simple picture of rural life. But the rifles, the tripwires, and the chilling sign told a different story. He swept the binoculars across the property, examining every detail. the woodpile, the garden, the darkened windows of the house, and then he saw it. It was a small detail, something anyone else would have missed. Hanging on a nail by the side of a small woodshed was a collection of greasy rags, probably used for cleaning tools or guns. Most of them were gray and stained, but one of them was a bright, vibrant teal. Arthur's hands began to shake. He adjusted the focus on the binoculars, his heart pounding in his ears. The color was unmistakable. It was the exact shade of the high-end rain jacket Nora had bought just for this trip. She'd been so proud of it, calling it her lucky teal jacket. It was a unique, almost unnatural color for the wilderness, which is why he remembered it so vividly. It was just a piece of fabric. It could be a coincidence, but Arthur didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. That piece of cloth was a scream in the silence. It was proof. Nora had been here. He stayed on the ridge until the sun began to dip below the trees, his mind racing. He had what he needed. He had a reason to bring the law here. He began his slow, careful descent, moving away from the compound, planning his route back to the boat. He was so focused on moving silently that he didn't hear the sound until it was too late. A single, sharp snap of a twig directly behind him. Arthur froze, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his back. "You're a long way from home, old man." The voice was low and gravelly. Arthur turned slowly. Standing not 20 feet away was Malachi Barlow, his rifle held loosely but pointed in Arthur's general direction. His face was emotionless, but his eyes were cold and hard. "This is private land," Malachi said, taking a slow step forward. "Folks who get lost out here have a way of staying lost." The threat hung in the air between them, as real and as dangerous as the weapon in his hand. Arthur kept his movements slow, deliberate. He raised his hands slightly, showing they were empty. The cold weight of the revolver pressed against his spine, a secret he hoped he wouldn't have to reveal. "I'm Arthur Finch," he said, his voice calm and even. He met the younger man's gaze without aggression. "I used to be the sheriff here." Malachi's lips curled into a faint, dismissive smirk. "We know who you are. Don't make you any less of a trespasser. My father don't care much for badges, retired or not. My daughter and her fiancé went missing out here last year," Arthur continued, keeping his tone conversational, a tactic he'd used 1,000 times to de-escalate tense situations. "Nora Finch, maybe you heard about it." "We hear a lot of things," Malachi said, shifting his weight. He didn't lower the rifle. "Mostly, we hear the sound of people who can't mind their own business. I'm just a father looking for answers." "Then you should be looking in the lake," Malachi said coldly. "That's what the new sheriff said happened. Tragic accident. Now, you're on our land. I'm going to walk you to the edge of it, and you're not ever going to come back. Understand?" There was no room for argument. Arthur gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I understand." Malachi gestured with the rifle. "Start walking that way." The journey back to the edge of the Barlow property was the longest 20 minutes of Arthur's life. Malachi walked a few paces behind him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken threats. Arthur could feel the man's eyes on him, could hear the soft crunch of his boots on the forest floor. He was being escorted out like a common criminal, but inside his mind was racing. The confrontation confirmed it. Malachi's hostility, his immediate deflection to the official story, his refusal to show even a hint of human sympathy. It wasn't the behavior of an innocent man annoyed by a trespasser. It was the behavior of a man with a secret, a dark secret he was willing to guard with a gun. When they reached the invisible line that marked the end of the Barlow's world, Malachi stopped. "This is as far as I go. Don't make the mistake of coming back, Mr. Finch. We're a family that values its privacy." Arthur turned to face him one last time. "One day, the truth about what happens in these woods is going to come out." Malachi's expression didn't change. The woods are good at keeping secrets. Arthur watched him melt back into the trees, then made his way to his boat, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had seen the teal rag. He had felt the menace from Malachi. It wasn't just a theory anymore. He knew. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the Barlows were involved in his daughter's disappearance. The question was no longer where to look, but how to get past the walls of a family that had declared war on the outside world. He didn't go home. He drove straight to Sheriff Peterson's office in town. The station was modern and clean, a stark contrast to the cramped, dusty space Arthur had occupied for 30 years. Peterson's office was behind a glass wall, and he looked up with a flicker of annoyance as Arthur walked in without knocking. "Arthur," Peterson said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. He was in his late 30s, with a neat haircut and a politician's smile that never quite reached his eyes. "What can I do for you?" Arthur placed the splintered paddle on the polished surface of Peterson's desk. The crude carving of "turn back" faced up. Peterson stared at it for a moment, then sighed. "Hank already called me about this. It's a sad thing, Arthur, but it doesn't change the facts of the case. A storm can do strange things." "The storm came from the north," Arthur said, his voice flat. "This paddle was found on the north shore, jammed into the mud. You and I both know that's impossible if they capsized where you think they did." "Currents are complex," Peterson said dismissively, waving a hand. "I also paid a visit to the Barlow place," Arthur said, watching the sheriff's reaction carefully. Peterson's smile vanished. He sat up straight. "You did what?" "Arthur, you can't go harassing people. The Barlows are eccentric, but they have a right to their privacy. You, of all people, should know that. Their privacy is protected by tripwires and armed patrols," Arthur shot back. "And one of their sons threatened me. Told me that people who get lost out here tend to stay lost." Peterson's expression tightened. "Did he threaten you directly?" "It was a direct threat, and we both know it." Arthur leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. "Listen to me, Dan. I saw something else. A piece of my daughter's jacket, a teal one being used as a rag on their property. It was her. A piece of cloth? That's what you're bringing me? A piece of cloth and a vague threat from a family of recluses? That's not enough to get a warrant, and you know it. They'll sue the county, and they'll win." "So you're not going to do anything?" Arthur asked, his voice rising with frustration. "There's nothing I can do based on this," Peterson said, his tone final. "I'm sorry for your loss, Arthur, I truly am. But you're too close to this. You're seeing things that aren't there. Go home. Grieve. Don't go making trouble where there isn't any." Arthur stared at the younger man, a cold fury building inside him. Peterson wasn't a cop. He was a manager. He was worried about lawsuits and budgets, not about justice. Arthur had been a fool to think he could help. "I see," Arthur said quietly. He picked up the paddle. "I'll be taking this back then, since it's not important evidence. Arthur, leave it here." "It belongs to my daughter," Arthur said, turning and walking out of the office. He knew he couldn't fight this battle through official channels. If he was going to get answers, He would have to do it himself. For the next 2 days, Arthur planned. He knew he couldn't go back to the compound the way he had before. They would be watching for him now. He needed a different way in, and he needed to go when they wouldn't expect it. He needed to find proof that Peterson couldn't ignore. He spent hours studying his detailed maps, looking for another way onto the Barlow land. He finally found it, an old, abandoned logging trail that the maps showed petering out about half a mile from the western edge of their property. It would be a long, difficult hike through dense, untracked forest, but it would bring him in from the opposite direction. They'd be watching the lake, not the deep woods. He decided to go at night. He packed a small black backpack with night vision binoculars, a powerful flashlight, rope, a first aid kit, and water. He dressed in dark clothing, and again he holstered his revolver. This time he knew he might have to use it. As he made his preparations, he thought about Nora. He imagined her fear, her strength. She would have fought. She wouldn't have just given up. That paddle was proof. She had tried to leave a message, a clue. She was counting on someone to find it. She was counting on him. He left under the cover of darkness, telling no one where he was going. He parked his truck miles away from the trailhead, hiding it in a thicket of trees, and began his long walk. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. The woods were a place of deep shadows and strange noises. But Arthur wasn't afraid. He moved with a singular purpose. The grief and fear burned away by a cold, hard resolve. The hike was even more difficult than he'd anticipated. The old logging trail was almost completely overgrown, and he had to push his way through thick brush and navigate around fallen trees. It took him nearly 3 hours to cover the few miles to the Barlow property line. He found their perimeter just before dawn. He was deep in their territory now, moving from tree to tree, as silent as a ghost. Using the night vision binoculars, he scanned the compound from his new vantage point on the west side. A single light burned in the main house. The rest of the property was dark and still. His target was the barn. The older brother, Corbin, had come from the barn, and the barn was where a person could be held, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. He waited until the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern sky, the hour when sleep is deepest. Then he began his approach. He moved across the clearing in a low crouch, his heart pounding a steady rhythm. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a gunshot in the pre-dawn stillness. He reached the side of the barn without being detected. The wood was old and weathered. The gaps between the logs chinked with dried mud. He pressed his ear against the wall, listening. At first he heard nothing. Then a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic creak, and another sound, a muffled cough. Someone was inside. He crept along the wall to a small, grimy window about 5 feet off the ground. It was too high to see through clearly. He looked around and saw a stack of old apple crates a few feet away. He carefully moved one under the window, tested its stability, and slowly raised himself up. He peered through the dirty glass. The inside of the barn was dark, filled with shadows and the shapes of old farm equipment. But there was a section in the back, a large animal stall that had been boarded up, the entrance covered with a heavy wooden door, secured by a thick iron bolt on the outside. And from a small barred opening in that makeshift cell, he saw a flicker of movement. He adjusted his position, trying to get a better angle. A face appeared in the small opening. It was pale and thin, with a matted beard, but the eyes... Arthur would have known those eyes anywhere. It was Caleb. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He wanted to shout, to smash the window, to tear the door off its hinges. But he forced himself to stay calm. He saw Caleb's lips move, but he couldn't hear the words. Then another figure appeared beside him. A smaller frame, with long, tangled hair. Nora. She was alive. They were both alive. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him, followed immediately by a surge of pure, cold rage. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He had a weak signal, but it might be enough. He snapped a single, blurry photo through the grimy window, praying it was clear enough. Then he dialed 911. He spoke in a low, urgent whisper. "This is Arthur Finch. I'm at the Barlow property on Saginaga Lake. I have visual confirmation. They're holding my daughter, Nora Finch, and Caleb Hale captive in their barn. They are alive. I need backup immediately. They are armed and dangerous." He gave the dispatcher his coordinates and ended the call. Now, all he could do was wait and pray that help would arrive before the Barlows woke up. He slid down from the crate and concealed himself in the deep shadows along the barn wall, his revolver now in his hand. The sky was getting lighter. Time was running out. He heard a door creak open at the main house. The day was beginning at the Barlow compound, and Arthur was ready for it. The first to emerge was Jedediah Barlow himself. He was a tall, gaunt figure, his face a roadmap of hard years and harder beliefs. He stood on the porch for a moment, stretching in the morning air, then called back into the house. A few minutes later, Corbin and Malachi came out, both carrying rifles. They exchanged a few words with their father, then split up. Corbin heading toward the garden and Malachi starting a slow patrol of the clearing. Malachi's path would take him right past Arthur's hiding spot. Arthur pressed himself flat against the barn, his heart hammering. He could hear the crunch of Malachi's boots getting closer. 10 feet, 5 feet. Malachi walked past without a glance, his eyes fixed on the tree line. Arthur held his breath until the footsteps faded. He knew he couldn't just wait for the police to arrive. Peterson and his deputies would likely come to the front gate, announce themselves, and give the Barlows all the time in the world to react. Nora and Caleb were hostages. He had to create a diversion, something to draw the Barlows away from the barn. His eyes landed on the woodpile that Corbin had been working on a few days ago. Next to it was a shed, and next to the shed were several large fuel cans. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in his mind. He waited until Malachi was on the far side of the clearing, then darted from the barn to the cover of the woodshed. He grabbed one of the fuel cans. It was heavy, filled with gasoline for the generator or chainsaw. He unscrewed the cap and began to splash the fuel over the large, dry wood pile. He worked fast, his hands shaking slightly. He emptied half the can, then set it down and pulled a small waterproof matchbox from his backpack. This was it. There was no going back. He struck a match. The small flame flickered in the gray morning light. He took a deep breath and tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked wood. The pile erupted in a whoosh of flame and black smoke. The fire caught instantly, climbing high into the air, the heat intense even from 20 feet away. "Fire!" The shout came from Jedediah on the porch. The Barlows reacted instantly. Jedediah and Corbin ran toward the fire with buckets, shouting an alarm. Malachi came sprinting back across the clearing, his rifle forgotten for the moment, as he joined his family in a frantic attempt to fight the blaze. This was his chance. Arthur ran from the woodshed to the barn door, his revolver held ready. He had one target, the heavy iron bolt on the cell door. He fumbled with it for a precious second, his fingers cold and stiff. The bolt was thick, seated deep in its housing. He couldn't move it. He heard shouting behind him. The Barlows had noticed him. "Hey, get away from there!" He ignored them. He put the muzzle of his revolver against the iron housing of the bolt and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the barn. The bullet ricocheted off the iron with a high-pitched scream, but the impact had done its job. The housing was shattered. He kicked the bolt loose and tore the heavy door open. Nora and Caleb were huddled in the back of the dark, foul-smelling stall. Their faces were thin and pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Dad?" Nora whispered, as if he were a ghost. "It's me," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to go. Now." He helped them to their feet. They were weak, unsteady. As he guided them out of the barn, the Barlows were running toward them, their faces contorted with rage. Jedediah was in the lead, a wild look in his eyes. "You're not taking them," he roared. Arthur raised his revolver. "Stay back, Jedediah. It's over. The police are on their way. This is our land, our law!" Jedediah screamed and lunged at him. From behind Arthur, Caleb, weak as he was, let out a yell and shoved Nora behind him, stepping forward to meet Jedediah's charge. At the same moment, the sound of sirens cut through the morning air, growing rapidly closer. The sound broke the spell. The Barlows froze, looking toward the main track leading to their property. For the first time, Arthur saw fear in their eyes. The world they had tried so hard to keep out was crashing through their gates. Sheriff Peterson's cruiser skidded to a halt in the clearing, followed by two more. Deputies spilled out, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons! Hands in the air!" Peterson commanded, his voice amplified by a megaphone. The fight went out of the Barlows. Corbin and Malachi slowly lowered their rifles. Jedediah stared at the police, then at Arthur, his face a mask of bitter defeat. It was over. The aftermath was a blur of police activity, medical personnel, and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Nora and Caleb were wrapped in blankets and checked by paramedics before being taken to the hospital. They were severely malnourished and dehydrated, but they were alive. Arthur gave his statement to a stunned Sheriff Peterson, handing over his phone with the blurry photo that had started it all. He watched as the Barlows were handcuffed and led away, their reign of terror on this small piece of the wilderness finally at an end. Later, at the hospital, Nora told him the whole story. They had paddled close to the Barlows' shore, looking for a place to camp for the night, not realizing it was private property. Malachi had appeared on the shore and fired a warning shot that had torn through the side of their canoe. As it sank, the Barlows had come out in a boat, not to rescue them, but to capture them. They dragged them to their compound, terrified that if they let them go, they would report the shooting and bring the law down on them. "The first night we were there," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb managed to grab his whittling knife before they took it. "While they were arguing about what to do with us, I found the broken paddle from the canoe. I carved the message on it, hoping, praying, that if I threw it into the water, the current might take it somewhere, that someone might find it. She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. I was hoping you would find it, Dad. Arthur took her hand, his own tears finally falling. I did, sweetheart. I did. A few months later, life had begun to find a new, gentler rhythm. The Barlows were convicted on multiple charges, including kidnapping and assault, and were sentenced to long prison terms. The story had been national news for a while, a sensational tale of survival and a father's relentless search. Nora and Caleb were slowly healing, both physically and emotionally. They stayed with Arthur at his quiet house, the three of them rebuilding their lives together. One sunny afternoon, Arthur was sitting on his back porch, watching Nora and Caleb planting a small garden. He saw the easy way they moved together, the quiet smiles they shared. The trauma was still there, in the shadows behind their eyes, but so was resilience, so was love. He looked over at the corkboard in his study, visible through the screen door. The map of the boundary waters was still tacked to the wall. He stood up, walked inside, and gently pulled the thumbtacks from the corners. He folded the map carefully, its creases soft and familiar, and put it away in a drawer. The search was over. His daughter was home. The quiet in the house was no longer empty. It was peaceful. What do you think drives a person like Jedediah Barlow to completely cut off from the world and become so hostile? Is it fear, a desire for control, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of a father's love and determination. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more true stories that deserve to be told. Every bit of support helps us bring these narratives to light.